Thank you for sticking around for the workshop. So this is a planned activity we put in on our original bid to research Reclaim. Myself, Laura, Izzy and Pat received funding from Research Reclaim, not only to put on writing workshops, but part of our bid was to help build solidarity across academics facing similar issues. I think academia has huge advantages for its workers, especially in the global north. I think many of us have family members who don't work in academia and can sometimes think, okay, there's certainly great things about our jobs. But there are also systematic problems or inequalities that match up with wider inequalities in the world, especially racism, sexism, and class barriers. So with that in mind, this workshop aims to start confronting and addressing, in particular, gendered and racialized research barriers. The aim is not to individualize these barriers, but to situate us all within a system that has advantages, but also these particular disadvantages. As much as possible, evidence is used to substantiate the claims, but you don't have to agree with all of them to get the intended message. So this is what, in between the workshop, I'd love you to consider these 4 questions. We'll have space for you to consider them, but I'm just putting them up now. Firstly, if comfortable, please discuss a research barrier you have witnessed, or if you wish, you have encountered. Name one under-cited researcher and their research that you believe should get more attention. Consider how to confront research barriers without individualizing them, in particular without bestowing guilt on any individuals, but rather trying to challenge the system we're in. At the end of the workshop, I'll try and draw to resources that do that, and recommend a resource that challenges a research barrier if one isn't listed here. So, Oloramadi Olisa is here, obviously, a very welcome member of our writing retreat groups and is really putting a lot of this into practice in social work across academia and the practice of social work in quite an inspiring way of disrupting a potential cycle of racist and other inequalities where social workers are at the front line of vulnerable children that are sometimes trained in white and Western discipline. So Olu has kindly agreed to talk, and we'll get to her presentation in a bit. So for now, I'll talk about gender inequalities in citations, in research, in higher education. Then we'll get to a pair share activity. Then we'll talk briefly about race inequalities in those areas. Then we'll try and think about this broadly, where often people who face inequalities can interpret them as a personal failing or imposter syndrome. And critical researchers argue it's not a personal failing, but a rational response to an unequal system. And that reframing can be quite powerful for building solidarity. And then we'll look at some resources that people have developed to try and challenge some of these inequalities. Okay, so on average, women are 30% less likely to be cited than their male colleagues. This is even after controlling for various confounding variables like the journal name, the number of co-authors, the date that the articles have been published in. This is found across different disciplines. I am citing mostly psychology studies in this presentation, unfortunately, because that's where I come from, but it's an interdisciplinary finding. So sociology has been found to have a gender citation gap, psychology, of course, international relations, and just one example, neuroscience, where in particular, in a study of 270,000 citations, papers that were authored by multiple men were overcited on average. Papers that were authored by multiple women were particularly undercited. So we can see here a male privilege and a form of sexism, meaning the gap between male-male papers and female-female papers can be quite large. This can contribute to a cycle of sexism in academia. Women are less likely to self-cite their own work, and that is one of the major contributors to this citation gap. Women are less likely to publish compared to men. To make robust or generalized claims from their research compared to men, get grant funding, and be promoted. And citations are a metric widely valued in higher education and in promotions. And so this is the start of the cycle. We have wider inequalities in research, which is a big part of academia and higher education. So in psychological research, gendered citation gaps maintain what's known as androcentrism. They maintain and contribute and are caused by androcentrism. This is the practice of assuming all humans are male. In cartoons like Winnie the Pooh, a typical feature is that there will only be one female character, in this case Kanga, the mother character, where all other characters representing a range of emotions, such as Eeyore and depression, are male. In the Smurfs, there is one female character, a Smurfette, in a land of male Smurfs. This has real implications in beyond the cartoon world, such as in medicine, where heart attack research or car crash fatality research tends to be on male bodies, male car crash dummies, which means that women have a higher likelihood of dying in a car crash because they're tested on human bodies that are designed to mimic male people rather than the full human spectrum. Heart attack symptoms for women differ typically than men, and that means that women's heart attack symptoms are less likely to be recognized because the campaigns and research have typically been on male subjects. Psychological research has often, especially historically, been on majority or all male samples. You might know of Milgram's obedience shock experiments, which were majority male, but one of the most famous studies in psychology, and this limitation isn't acknowledged. Peter Hegarty is a critical researcher working now who still finds this practice in psychological studies, that male samples can still exist without critique, and also putting male names and male data first or leftmost in journal publications means that unfortunately the people that read that data, whether it's in graphical or table form, think of men as being the default or the standard and women being secondary in some way. How do these inequalities get into research? Brilliant work from Shibley Hyde, a feminist psychologist, traces all of the different ways that biases can creep into the research process from conception to dissemination. For example, she points out that sometimes researchers can only ask certain types of questions that inherently other women. She gives the example of asking what effect do working mothers have on their children's well-being rather than working fathers or working parents on their children's well-being. Or research is only interested in the relationships between hormones and mood when it comes to women rather than men who also have hormonal cycles. She also talks about the research process itself. For example, as mentioned, androcentric samples, where the majority of participants can be male. And then unfortunately, gendered publication bias. A wider problem of publication bias is only reporting significant results. And this can be particularly true if sex differences are found in research. For example, research that typically finds men and women are much more similar in behavior and other skills doesn't tend to be published as often as research that finds they are different. This leads to conclusions in the popular science, popular common sense of men and women being from different planets, Mars and Venus, and reflects historically psychology's contribution to this, such as concluding that women are more emotional than men, more verbal, less mathematically skilled, less spatially skilled, less aggressive. All conclusions that psychological research have ascertained. In higher education, as a workforce and an institution, empirical evidence supports the idea that women are more likely to face a range of inequalities that disrupt their progression, including appearance scrutiny. Analysis of teaching evaluations finds more comments relating to appearance, dress, and age of women educators rather than male educators, including nurturing expectations, and in particular, an expectation that women educators should be perennially, regardless of the situation, nice and kind and empathic, rather than experts or knowledge disseminators. Women researchers can be referred to as Miss or by their first name more often than Doctor. Teaching evaluations tend to be stricter for women as well. Experimental studies have shown that marks that have been released to students over 2 days after they were submitted were rated as 15% more negatively and more unfairly if the releaser had a female name than a male name, whereas the mark distribution was identical in either controlled condition. And are more likely to take pastoral or holistic work and have to uptake this kind of pastoral work. This includes equality, diversity, inclusive initiatives in higher education, but also work such as more academic advisees and student care. Cordelia Fine is a feminist neuroscientist researcher who's very compelling in her work, especially because she knows the tools and languages of the wider neuroscience community. And she traces these nurturing expectations on women from historical 18th century texts, philosophical texts, to modern day psychological practice. In particular, she quotes Thomas Gisborne in writing in the 18th century, "The superiority of the female mind is unrivaled, enjoying powers adapted to unbend the brow of the learned, and to diffuse throughout the family circle the enlivening and endearing smile of cheerfulness." The very esteemed neuroscientist and researcher Simon Baron-Cohen, cousin of Sacha Baron-Cohen, and seen as an expert on autism, writes in words quite similar in the 21st century. People with the female brain make the most wonderful counsellors, primary school teachers, nurses, carers, therapists, social workers, mediators, group facilitators, or personnel staff. One of the things all those jobs have in common, obviously, is whilst they're very important, they're also undervalued, underpaid, under-recognised, etc. So our first activity for the section, and after this we'll discuss do a different presentation, is to consider how to confront not this one, sorry,